So, welcome to this week's lecture for Understanding Contemporary Environmentalism. This week we're going to be talking about understanding capitalism. We all, of course, know capitalism. We live through it every day. So, I don't want to spend too much time today talking about this, but what I do want to do is point out three things about capitalism that are relevant to understanding the contemporary state of environmental activism. Those three things are the commodity form, the role of accumulation of growth in capitalism, and the relationship between culture and capitalism. These features will hopefully help you understand some of the nuance in Scott Prudhom's article and give a context for the kind of problems that Naomi Klein is pointing to. One of the key features of capitalism is that it runs based upon a system of exchange that uses a universal form of equivalence to move between products. That is, money, right? This is not to say that capitalism is the only system to use money, but that some of the important features of capitalism are built upon this relationship with money. Now, with money, what happens, as we know, is that there becomes a relationship of equivalence between objects that were not easily compared before. There's that saying, right? You can't compare apples and oranges. But with money, we actually can compare, and we do compare apples and oranges all the time. In this, two commodities, as we do with money, are seen to be equivalent to each other. They are worth a certain amount of money. And so money becomes a kind of universal mode of exchange that allows us to compare things that prior to that were much harder to compare or much harder to equate value to. Now, this is what we call the commodity form. It's a way of thinking about an object through the market, through how it compares to other things worth money. And in capitalism, it is this form, the commodity form, that gives objects value. Once we establish its equivalence to money, once we put a price on it, as they say, then it can be valued. Then we can say that it's worth something, then we can use it to be productive in an economic fashion or even in a sort of productive fashion. Biofuels are a good example here. Biofuels come from products that could be turned into food, or for labor and land that could be used for food. So, on a practical level, biofuels are comparable to food, right? Even outside of the economic realm. But in the commodity form, the only comparison that matters is the money equivalent, right? You might be able to compare how much caloric energy could have been made from a gallon of ethanol, but in the market, that's not important. What's important is how much money could be made from a gallon of ethanol or from a bundle of food. So then it becomes hard to value the fuel as a food source. And so during the biofuels bubble, food prices rose without care for the use of that commodity. That is, food prices rose without the recognition that food is an essential need, whereas biofuels aren't necessarily an essential need. Now, what Karl Marx suggests about money is that not only does it provide a way of making apples and oranges equivalent, but it is also a way of making products themselves equivalent to other things, including labor, right? So commodities are often not even actual objects. Sometimes they are services or ideas. So what this means is that we can figure out how much time an apple is worth to us if we compare it to our wage. How many minutes or hours do you have to work in order to get different commodities? For Marx, this meant a fundamental change in how we see the value of our labor. It isn't valued for what it actually produces. Instead, it is valued in relation to the money that we can get for that labor on the market. That is, it's only ever valued in a relationship to the market and therefore in a relationship to other commodities. Now, within environmentalism, as Naomi Klein points out, we also have a set of equivalences built upon values, right? So there's a further set of abstractions that can come about from the production of equivalence through the market. Now, she calls this liquid nature, drawing from the geographer Bram Boucher. Liquid nature is the way in which biophysical properties of nature are replaced in the market with their services to industrial development. So we know that nature, of course, is sold as both an object, but it's also sold as an abstract idea in many ways. So the carbon market that she talks about here is a good example. On a carbon market, it's possible to take a forest that has been in existence for hundreds of years, and by committing to conserve it for some years to come, transform it into credits that are equivalent to the pollution from industrial development elsewhere in the world. The forest then is valued not for where it is or what it has done in the location, but because it offsets carbon emissions elsewhere. Importantly, neither the forest's carbon sink or the emissions themselves are real products. They are only byproducts of different systems. And in fact, many times the products are only estimations, as it's hard to tell how much a forest actually stores carbon. So we have a number of equations and algorithms to produce that, but it's not an actual thing. It's an idea of a thing, or an abstract idea of a thing. Now, this is just one of a number of ways that environmental goods, and specifically environmentalist goods, are traded and given value in what might be called fictional ways. Ecosystem services is another example of that, and we'll talk about this later. Now, some economists would remind us that while carbon credits are fiction created through a logic of equivalence, where X number of trees are equal to this many pounds of carbon, that is the same logic that makes apples equal to oranges. That is, even though carbon trading is kind of built upon fictions of mathematical equations, it's still relying upon the same set of fictions that produces apples equals to oranges, right? We know that an apple is not an orange, but yet we treat it in many ways the same when we start to talk about it under the market. Now, the lesson here is that capitalism, through the commodity form, creates new forms of values. Some of these, as the articles for this week describe, are then sold as a way of protecting the environment. And again, this is the idea behind ecosystem service functions and the valuation of those services. So the second feature of capitalism that we're going to deal with today is the drive for accumulation held within capitalism. Now, in Scott Prudhom's article, he talks about accumulation for accumulation's sake. And he suggests that accumulation works against any of those environmentalist commodities that might come from green capitalism. But the question we want to ask now isn't so much about accumulation itself, but rather about where does this need for accumulation come from? Why is capitalism focused on growth? What part of its internal workings makes it focus on growth? And is it possible to have capitalism without growth? Now, this is a very complicated question. It's got a lot of different avenues to it, so I'm only going to be able to cover a small amount, or a small part of that debate. And what I want to focus on is two particular parts. So first, one of the first things is that within capitalism, we have a separation of labor from capitalism. So there's a distinction made between the means of production, the factory, the land, the machinery, and even the ideas of how and what to make. These are the means of production, or what we often call capital. And that's separated from the actual labor of producing products and services. So we have on the one side capital, which is the means of production, and labor, which is the actual work of producing things. Now, the private ownership of the means of production is a central tenet in capitalism. And it argues that owning those means of production is itself a form of capital, is itself a form of value. And those who own the means of production can then rent out, in many ways, the means of production to laborers who then produce it. And the laborers pay with their time and get paid to do it. Now, it's easy to understand why people sell their labor. Obviously, without work, we wouldn't be able to provide for ourselves under this system of capitalism. But there's nothing in labor that says you need to make more than you need. That is, it's entirely plausible, and in fact many people do it, to just work for what you want and not continue to get richer and richer, or accumulate more and more and more just to work based on your needs and a simple lifestyle. But capital, on the other hand, is a bit different. Capital is always built upon investment. And investments in many ways are only appealing if they promise more money in return. Sure, you could put it in and hope for a flat rate of return, right? The hope that you get back the money that it would take to repair the machine or repair the land, or that it took you to come up with that means of production or whatever. But there's always a risk, right? There's always risk involved in that investment, in that it might not come back to you. So investment generally demands that growth is built into there, that it grows at least in relation to the risk that it is taking. If it's not a very risky operation, then perhaps the expectation of growth is less. But if it is a risky operation, then the expectation of growth is more. So the fact that capitalism creates a mode of production that separates the labor of production from the means of production pushes a model built upon growth, because the means of production is expected to sort of take the risk on, and in order to do so, it expects a set of profits and ability to continue to grow. It's also worth noting here that, in fact, capital is only valued as it is invested, right? So owning a factory doesn't matter. It isn't worthwhile unless you're able to put that factory into production, that unless you're able to use that factory for capital growth. Now, a second key feature of capitalism is that there is competition within this system, right? The equivalence of commodities is based upon their ability to be sold upon the market. And that market is built upon competition. It's built upon a number of similar commodities being sold and a competition between those commodities. That competition then itself pushes growth. So here we have two kind of prime features in capitalism that push growth as a central part of the success of the overall economic system. Now, there is a large debate about whether or not capitalism can temper the growth that we have seen and operate without accumulation. And that debate, in fact, is still ongoing and brings in a number of different factors outside of the scope of this course. But it still has to reckon with the way in which labor and capital are separated, and the way in which the market is determining value through competition. What it is important to note about that question, though, is that for the most part, the forms of green capitalism that Prudhomme and Klein are talking about in their chapters, and indeed the large majority of green capitalism as a movement in reality, is not striving for zero growth. In fact, green capitalism, for the most part, accepts growth as a positive feature of capitalism and thinks that it can be bent towards conservation aims. So while there might be some push, and it's getting, sort of larger and larger within different groups for a sort of degrowth economy, often that is a new way, a new economic exchange outside of capitalism. Now, the final feature that I want to talk about today is the way in which culture is folded into capitalism. Now, again, here is a concept or a category of thinking, an area of thinking in which there is a lot to say on this topic. And for today, I just am going to cut to a short bit of that chase. So the first thing that I want to say is that the relationship between capitalism and culture is in part due to the drive for growth and accumulation. That cultural values become brought into this drive for growth and accumulation, that they are something that allows for increased markets or increased values. And we've seen this before, right? We know that one of the ways to increase your market share is to produce something that is new and appealing. Thus, of course, we see a new generation of iPhones every 18 months or so. And we also see a new set of cultural values with those phones or products. That is, it's not just the commodities themselves that are changing, but the cultural values that we associate with those commodities. Now, this change produces both increased values, where we will pay more for that commodity. It will also increase the market. It opens up the commodity to more sales. You need a new iPhone even though you already have one, or whatever it might be. So in the field of green capitalism, environmental values are now being sold as part of different commodities. So we have hybrid cars, organic foods, recycled clothing. etc. Now, some of these are built upon the actual features of the commodity, where lower emissions or less pesticides is the part of the commodity that we are sort of buying into. But sometimes the values are less clearly related to the commodity itself. So we find a number of products that use the money from its purchase to fund environmental projects, whether it's a 1% to the environment or a kind of green branding that is put on a commodity that then donates that water to clean, or that money to clean water funds or whatever. Now, in both of these circumstances where we have a sort of value relation or an actual feature of the commodity as being environmentalist, we are asked to pay for the values that they are meant to represent. So the environmental benefits of the product are valued more than what might be found in other similar commodities. Thus, the culture of environmentalism and our care for the environment is turned into a potential line of profit, which can, as I'm sure you've all seen, lead to an overemphasis or even fabrication of the environmental benefits of different products, right? This is what we know of as greenwashing, where the promises or the ideals of the commodity don't really end up being achieved in real life. Now, this relationship between culture and capitalism is what Prudhomme is pointing to in his discussion of the performance of green capitalism that sutures capitalism to environmental goals. And he says it's a fundamental part of how capitalism and environmentalism has been woven together. Now, this is where I'm going to sort of end my discussion or my lecture on capitalism by pointing out, of course, that obviously capitalism is a vastly complicated system, and my attempts to describe it will generally fall short. So if you have any more questions about it, please bring them to the class. What I've covered here is just a summary of 3 things that are key to helping us understand the relationship between capitalism and environmentalism that has developed over the past 40 years. In class, we'll try to address this relationship further with the use of the readings and any ideas that you might have come up with as you've been reading them.